When you open your eyes, you are in a dark room. The stone walls are damp, the air heavy, and filled with the sharp smell of grease and sweat. Only a few breaths of air remind you how far away freedom is. You are only 15 years old, but you have already lost the meaning of time. Remembering your birthdays, your childhood laughter, the cool breeze in your village is becoming increasingly difficult. Now, the rusty chain around your ankle feels more real than the world you left behind. Footsteps can be heard behind the door, heavy sandals echoing on the marble floor. You recognize that sound. The overseer is approaching. When the door opens, the harsh sunlight streaming in blinds your eyes. The large, shadowy figure appearing in the doorway is someone who has spent years breaking slaves. There is no pity in his eyes, only habit. He throws the dirty rag in his hand at you. Clean yourself. The master has guests tonight. These words may seem like a routine command coming from his lips, but for you, they spell a nightmare. Because guests mean your body will once again be offered for money. We are taught stories filled with philosophy, art, and democracy, the bright side of ancient Greece. However, the dark side of this magnificent world is rarely found in history books. Few of us know that the cities that spoke of democracy and freedom were actually built on the backs of thousands of people who had lost their freedom. Hundreds, thousands of young male slaves like you formed the invisible building blocks of this system. Everything began with a family debt, a bad harvest, or a war. Perhaps your father couldn't pay his debts. Perhaps your village was raided. Perhaps your beauty alone brought trouble upon you. There was something you didn't know as a child. In Greek villages, a bad year could mean not only hunger, but also the sale of children. The slave traders came to the village square, chains and thick ledgers in hand. Human bodies were bought and sold for silver, and your fate was reduced to a few shiny coins left in your father's palm. When your father extended his trembling hands, your mother covered her face with her hands and cried. You didn't understand why they averted their eyes. You only heard a stranger examining you say, "She's the right age, healthy, pretty face." A few copper coins bought your childhood. The journey through the city passed in chains. Dozens of children, lined up shoulder to shoulder, were being led along with their hands and feet bound. Some were crying silently, others were whispering for their mothers. The guards ensured silence with their whips. The scenery you saw along the Whale of Groves, the sparkling sea, mountain peaks was no longer a view of freedom for you, but a backdrop of pain in the shadow of chains. And then you arrived at the slave market in Athens. It was like a huge stage set up in the heart of the city. The crowds, the noise, the shouting. A place where people were displayed, sold, and bought like merchandise. Children like you had their bodies rubbed with oil to make them shine, and forced smiles plastered on their faces, because bodies that looked shiny fetched a higher price. When you were brought onto the stage, you were no longer a person, but an object. The merchant loudly announced your age, origin, health, even the color of your eyes. A man stepped forward. He wore an expensive purple garment. Purple was the color of wealth and power. His eyes lingered on you. At that moment, you felt that your life now belonged entirely to him. This man, whose name you didn't even know, had become your master. Shortly thereafter, you were taken to his home. By home, I mean it was actually like a magnificent palace, marble columns, colorful mosaics, images of gods on the walls. But in the lowest level, in cold stone rooms, there were young people chained up. You saw a familiar emptiness in their eyes, a deep sadness. They all shared the same fate. You were now one of them, and this is where the real story begins. While the philosophers of ancient Greece talked about virtue, justice, and freedom during the day, at night they used children like you as objects of entertainment. It's time to remember this silent, forgotten face of history. It didn't take you long to understand what life was like in your new master's house. From the very beginning, the rules were clear. You couldn't choose when to eat, when to sleep, or when to speak. Even the master's shadow determined your every breath. Every morning you were fed a thin porridge and a few olives, and in the evening you had to make do with dry bread. This wasn't meant to make you strong, but merely to keep you alive. Overseer Demetrios was a former slave. He had once been broken himself, then became his master's whip. His stern gaze, ruthless rules, and constant whip maintained order in the house. He demanded not only your service, but also your submission. Don't look up, avert your eyes, don't speak, just obey orders. These rules quickly became the rhythm of your life. Upstairs in the house were magnificent rooms, marble columns, and mosaics. But downstairs, in chained rooms, young men like you lived. The emptiness you saw in their eyes began to settle in yours a few months later. Once a child who played, shouting his own name, now they had given you another name. So you wouldn't remember who you were. One night, you heard that a major symposium was being prepared for the first time. There was a flurry of activity at home. The guests were Athens' most respected men, philosophers, politicians, wealthy merchants. These men, who spoke of virtue and justice in history books, would show their other faces when night fell. The preparation ceremony was frightening for you. The other slaves warned those as young as you, there will be plenty of wine flowing today. The topics start with philosophy, but as the night progresses, other things are demanded. Your body was polished with olive oil, and you were dressed in fine tunics. You were treated not like a human being, but like a decorative object. The living room smelled heavily of wine. The guests were sprawled on the couches, loudly discussing democracy. You, however, were silently serving them wine, forcing yourself to keep your hands steady. At first, the requests were innocent. Massage that philosopher's shoulder over there, fill that man's cup. But then the requests changed. The longer the glances lingered, the bolder the touches became. A guest called you over. There was a tearful but powerful expression in their eyes. They asked you questions. Where are you from? Do you miss your family? Are they treating you well here? The words, which seemed polite at first, were soon accompanied by touches. The hand on your shoulder slowly slid down your back, then further down. When you tried to escape, laughter erupted. Your struggle was merely entertainment for them. That night, childhood ended. For you, it was ordinary pain. For them, it was just a game. And when you woke up the next morning, the old you was gone. Over time, you learned that these symposium nights were not merely feasts. The masks of free people fell away, and respected members of society indulged their darkest desires. Democracy, art, philosophy. You began to understand that the stones upon which all these things were built were actually the broken bodies of people like you. Some tried to resist. A boy named Marcus attempted to escape. When he was caught, he was beaten so badly that he couldn't walk for weeks. When Alexios defied his master's orders, he was left hungry and chained for 3 days. The price of resistance was always heavy. But those who didn't resist faced another kind of death. They lost their sense of self. You learned over time to avoid eye contact, to anticipate orders, to make your presence invisible, because that way, at least you could survive. But you learned a difference between surviving and living, suffering a little more each day. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The passage of time was now measured only by the rhythm of the symposiums. At first, you were lost in the agonizing screams, but at some point, you realized that even the screams weren't yours. Your body was there, but your spirit seemed to have been pulled elsewhere. You moved like a shadow, serving without thinking. The other slaves were the same. Marcus no longer spoke of escape plans as he used to. He just stared silently. The scars on Alexios' face reminded him of what he faced every night. Some chose to remain silent, rather than resist, hiding their souls behind walls. You learned to predict what lies behind the slightest smile on a guest's face, to sense in advance where a touch will lead. This knowledge didn't save you, but it kept you alive. The most painful thing was who came. The men history books introduced to us as virtuous philosophers turned into the cruelest masters at night. An orator who lectured on justice and freedom during the day treated slave children mercilessly at night. A merchant, known as a philanthropist, who generously helped the city's poor, was enjoying cruel tortures here. And perhaps most painful of all, a wise man who wrote about philosophy was trampling the virtue he wrote about in his own home. At each symposium, you understood more and more. The democracy these men had established was an illusion built on people like you. You and your kind were condemned to slavery for their freedom. One night, a game was organized for the amusement of young aristocrats. Slaves were called up one by one, and even the slightest disobedience was punished amid laughter. At that moment, something snapped. You no longer saw yourself as a human being, but only as an object in their eyes. Perhaps this was the death of your soul, but it also meant that the pain was easing, because there was no hope left. Without hope, there was no disappointment either. Years passed. Your youthful face had faded, and you no longer held any charm in the eyes of your masters. One morning Demetrios called you. "We're sending you to the mines." His words were neither a threat nor a reward. It was simply an economic decision, because old slaves were replaced with new ones. The mines were the slow but certain address of death. No one returned alive from there. As you made your way through the mountains along the road, you thought about your past, your village, your mother's tears, your father's trembling hands. They all faded away like mist. When you arrived at the mining camp, the scene you saw was even darker than the symposiums at home. Hundreds of slaves worked in narrow tunnels, surrounded by suffocating dust. Here, bodies wore out faster, but at least their spirits clung to each other beyond the chains. The slaves had formed their own small networks of solidarity. Some shared food, some tended to wounds, some simply listened quietly to each other's stories. That's when you realized the greatest resistance was reminding each other of our humanity, because what the system wanted most was to convince you that you weren't human. Your life ended there, between dust and darkness. One day your breath stopped, your lungs could no longer bear the rock dust. But your fellow slaves promised, "We will not forget your name," and so your story was never written in the official history books. But it lived on in the whispers of those left behind. Today we look with admiration at the philosophy, art, and theater of ancient Greece. But we must not forget that splendor was built upon the suffering of hundreds of thousands of invisible slaves. The voices echoing among those stone statues and marble temples were not only those of philosophers, but also the cries of chained children. And the most painful truth is that this system is not just a thing of the past. Even today, children are being sold in many parts of the world, people are being chained up for debt, and companies or regimes are exploiting their labor. Only the chains have changed, but the pain remains the same. Your story became a reflection of theirs. Times have changed, but humanity's dark side has not. Perhaps that is why we must remember. Because every name we forget allows the same pain to be relived throughout history.